On this very day, exactly 24 years ago, Ridge Racer V was released for the PlayStation 2 as a launch title, giving people a taste of what was to come with the next generation. While I may not have any personal ties with the franchise like I do Need for Speed or Colin McRae Rally, a few months back I developed an interest in this series and have been enjoying a good number of its entries. I want to use this video as an appropriate opportunity to talk about Ridge Racer V and why it stood out to me specifically, even amongst arguably better titles both within and outside of the same franchise. As it's evident from the title, Ridge Racer V is an arcade racer. And when I say arcade, I mean arcade, if you catch my power slide. Unlike a Need for Speed or Midnight Club, where creative liberties have clearly been taken while still being at least somewhat respectful to how cars actually handle, with Ridge Racer, it's all about stiff, straight line handling and drifting around every corner. Hold up. Through a modern lens, this approach to driving is a bit of an acquired taste now that Forza Horizon has all but taken over with its Simcade approach, though that's not to say Ridge Racer's driving DNA can't still be felt in stuff like Burnout and later the Asphalt series. Anyway, as for the difficulty, Double RV is unfortunately victim to an all too common difficulty dilemma, especially in the racing genre, where easy is way too easy, even to the point of me lapping people on even the longest of tracks. Normal is a little harder than I'm comfortable with, and hard is just impossible about save states or photographic track memorization. I know that I mentioned in my Need for Speed Shift video that I usually prefer more difficult opponents, but with how unforgiving collisions are in this game, and in the arcade sense, they just slow you down a ton, there's obviously no damage modeling, I end up finding the racing part of Ridge Racer to not be all that rewarding, but rather a case of Wipeout, where you hit a wall and you might as well restart or load your last state. The joy of Ridge Racer 5, or any game in the series really, comes more from the presentation and track layouts than the racing, to be honest. In fact, let's look at the latter of the two. As it's not too uncommon for this franchise, the track selection isn't exactly rich. You've really got one main location to race around, Ridge City, and an oval track. That's about it. Obviously, you get a decent variety of track configurations and times of day so that you're not literally doing the same race for the whole game. But let's just say if you gravitate more towards the globe-trotting track lists of Need for Speed High Stakes or Porsche Unleashed, or don't care for aesthetic variety and just want a wealth of courses, each with their own nuances to master, then you might be disappointed. As an NFS kid, this was obviously a little jarring to me as well, though over time I started to develop the sense of belonging to Ridge City and an intimate familiarity with each district and outskirt of the city, almost akin to that of an open world racer, but on a smaller scale, obviously. The car selection is likewise tame, at just 6 cars categorized primarily by their handling type: drift or grip. Don't let those names fool you though. Much like Grid 2, you're gonna be sliding around corners regardless. It's just that the two handling types have some sort of effect that I'm still not too sure of on how you initiate power slides. Obviously, drift type cars are easier to get going, while the grip cars have a more subtle approach to entering corners. But ultimately, this isn't some Ghost Games era Need for Speed situation where there's a drastic effect on a car's stability. Completing the standard Grand Prix rewards you with a modified version of whatever car you used to do so, incentivizing repeat playthroughs much like Type 4 and its end-of-race placement system. You also seem to get different engines after completing both standard and extra Grand Prix, but I honestly never felt the need to make any specific modifications since the game usually equips the most suitable engine for the given car and race. I'm sure there's more to this, but it's no Gran Turismo car tuning, that's for sure. As I said a moment ago, the appeal of Ridge Racer, to me, is not necessarily the racing, but the way it's presented. Let's start with the visuals, more specifically, the performance. We take 60 FPS even on console racers for granted today, but this was March of 2000, a time when the only console that even came close to consistently outputting 60 frames per second when rendering any amount of polygons on screen was the Dreamcast. And while I love that loud-ass disc reader, its limited install base didn't exactly shift things in favor of consoles as far as performance goes. Obviously, Double RV wasn't the first 60 FPS polygonal console game ever. I mean, even fucking Rascal ran at 60 somehow. I forgot to mention my Need for Speed retrospective, but Need for Speed Hot Pursuit actually stays in the mid-40s and 50s when using the bumper cam too. It wasn't just the novelty of the frames, but also what you were being shown through them. While Ridge Racer is best played using the bumper cam, I've recorded all of my footage in third person since that tends to look better for videos. And as you can see, the car models are a step above even PC racers like Porsche Unleashed, and stack up quite well to the visual powerhouse that was CMR 2.0 on PC. The art direction does away with the tinted color palettes of Type 4 in favor of a more natural look, which which gives the game a very clean aesthetic, and that goes doubly so for the menus. These little animations for each option still look great, and the short cutscenes you get when unlocking a car still look stylish and modern, even though the lighting is obviously fake. My only real issue with the visuals, which I'm sure can be fixed using custom textures or something, is the interlacing on some of the UI elements. Normally the whole game looks super interlaced, but obviously the gods of emulation come to the rescue, allowing the actual geometry to look nice and sharp. Hell, maybe there's some texture filtering option that fixes everything that I just haven't tried yet. Aside from that, the custom gauges for each car are appreciated, but I'm not a big fan of the font choices. They look pretty dated even for the time. As you would expect from a Ridge Racer game, the sound design also leans heavily into that clean aesthetic, primarily in the menus, complementing the slick animations. The car sounds are nothing to write home about, but it really was until the mid-2000s that racing games perfected that aspect of their presentation. The soundtrack is an interesting case because it abandons a lot of what defined Ridge Racer's musical identity, or at least what most people recognize as the Ridge Racer sound. Drum and bass mixed with dreamy, jazz-inspired chord progressions. Racer V's OST almost completely abandons the latter in favor of house, electronica, and electronic rock. I like to think my taste in music is as open as possible, but I really don't love every track here. While some songs have this extremely polished and future-proof sound, like Paris or Euphoria, there are some that make me genuinely question how they ever left the project file stage. There's a song called Daredevil that just sounds awful with these uninteresting and badly mixed riffs and an incomprehensible vocal arrangement. Also, the track Drift Devil, while I understand its inclusion as it's a speedcore song, that doesn't necessarily make it a great listen even in the middle of the action. Those songs aside, I overall enjoy more of the OST than not. Samurai Rocket's pretty cool. Fogbound is a bit cringy, but admittedly super catchy with that fuzzy ass bass line, and the menu tracks embody the spirit of the year 2000 in my head, of a time when technology was evolving rapidly and everything to do with it was awe-inspiring, even if it barely worked half the time. Lastly, I've got to comment on the DJ radio announcer guy that chimes in during the races. On one hand, I appreciate the greater variety in audio clips compared to the previous games, including the occasional bits of filler he throws in when you're in the lead and not interacting with your opponents at all. But on the other hand, I feel like something was lost when Namco decided to leave his voice completely unedited this time. In prior games, the announcer would usually have some sort of reverb or chorus or delay or just some sort of effect thrown on top to really give them this larger-than-life sound. I get that he's supposed to be a radio host and it's kind of what they sound like, but it takes away part of the effect, at least for me. And yes, I know DJ Stryker from SSX3 and Burnout Tree got the same treatment, but no offense to the voice actor, but his voice does not have the same charisma that can carry the performance on its own. Now I want to take a second to look at this game in context and where the racing genre as a whole was at around the time of its release. The late 90s and subsequently the year 2000 was a time of great change within the genre, from obvious improvements in technology enabling more elaborate and detailed roads to drive on, to the way developers approached car handling, and most significantly of all, how the overall experience was structured. You already know how Gran Turismo was the catalyst for that change in particular, and practically overnight, racing games started featuring more in-depth career modes than what was standard earlier in the decade. And this wasn't limited to just the games that strive for realism, but arcade racers were quickly adapting to the new precedent. Literally less than a year after the North American release of the original Gran Turismo, Need for Speed High Stakes started incorporating tournaments with specific car restrictions, damage, even fees for said damage, and a simple upgrade system. Just a few months before that came Colin McRae Rally, which featured damage and nuanced but still approachable car tuning. Even Tokyo Extreme Racer had subtle elements of performance damage and car tuning despite its otherwise arcade sensibilities. It would be pretty ignorant of me not to mention some of the things that changed about Ridge Racer during that time, like R4's car unlock system and little stories that accompanied each difficulty. Thing is, these really had nothing to do with chasing GT, but rather adding more longevity to what was becoming a very dated, even for that period, approach to racing game design. That leads me back to Ridge Racer 5 and what fascinates me about its design when compared to the changing gaming landscape. In a lot of ways, it takes steps back from R4, losing the characters and accompanying stories and car unlocks that change depending on your finishing position. Now it's back to just racing, getting stuff if you win, nothing if you lose. While all of this may sound like a criticism, and it actually was if reviews of this game are anything to go by, I actually don't hold any of its archaic design against the game. It just amazes me that it turned out this way to begin with, although I'm sure a big part of as to why Namco chose to keep it this retro, even from back then, was because this game really was, from a more corporate standpoint, a showcase of the PS2. You know, 60 FPS, 480i, better sound, and not to mention actually rendering nearly the entire pack on screen at once. If it were still a Y2K, and you were looking for a driving game for your Sony console that feels modern, mechanically detailed, and will keep you busy, then you either get Gran Turismo 2, Colin McRae Rally 2.0, Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed, or even the latest Toka. And if you were more into simple arcade racers that are a good time with friends, you got Crash Team Racing, Hot Wheels Turbo Racing, or even Double RV's own predecessor. I know I'm probably sending mixed messages at this point as far as whether or not this game is actually worth your time 24 years later, but I really do think it's a solid arcade racer, just one that feels a bit complacent in its game design. While it might be a bit dated in that regard, I couldn't feel any more opposite about Ridge Racer 5's presentation, and that's how I want to end this retrospective. Over the years, I've enjoyed games from nearly every era of the medium's existence, either by just being around at the right time or via emulation. Something I like to do when I'm bored is dive into a particular genre or a single ongoing franchise and explore how it's changed with time. After doing that with a couple dozen series, I've realized something. A game's age actually has very little bearing on how old it really feels. When I played Mario Wonder, a currently brand new platformer, I really didn't feel like I was that far from the early 90s. Sure, the presentation has improved greatly and there's some quality of life improvements, although Nintendo has stubbornly reintroduced the live system that has been out of date since the 2000s, but still, Mario Wonder doesn't feel like some future game, just a solid entry in a series that's been going for nearly 40 years. This familiar feeling is largely due to the combination of the core gameplay, which dates back to 1985, and the presentation, which has a very cartoony and modest sort of charm to it, while demonstrating less than cutting-edge graphical fidelity. Although I'm glad Nintendo made that choice because the game runs buttery smooth even on a Switch. Ridge Racer 5, on the other hand, has game design that dates back 5 years prior to its own release, yet its presentation has acted as a sort of video game cryostasis. It seriously cannot be overstated just how contemporary the game's visual language and sound design feel, especially that menu theme with its tasteful choice in synth timbre, simple melody, and chord changes. I also can't get over how good Paris sounds. Those piano parts are perfectly written, those swelling minor 7 chords suck you right in. The game's front end was also very cleverly done in such a way as to help it age well. Since the 6th console generation saw a massive jump in poly counts, but the texture quality wasn't quite as sharp as you probably like, the developers opted to render Ai Fukami as a silhouette. Couple that with some great quality motion capture, and the result is a visual that would look good even today. I guess my point is that this clean and tasteful presentation, combined with native 60 frames per second, has given Ridge Racer 5 a sort of technical longevity that something like the black box Need for Speeds could never have. Sometimes doing something simple really well leaves you with a much better end result. It's the same reason why puzzle games on, say, the Super Nintendo can still feel current. You don't need 12 gigs of VRAM to pull off Tetris Attack. I guess at this point I'm just romanticizing a time I wasn't around to witness, again, but that indescribable futurism of the year 2000 has been on my mind for weeks, and I just wanted to share that with you guys, alongside celebrating the release of an overlooked racer, although I understand why it ended up being that way. Thanks for listening once again. I hope to come up with some more random stuff to ramble about soon. See you then.